April 28, 1940, Kiel Naval Yards, Germany. Kapitän José Hermann Ehrlich stood on the incomplete flight deck of the Graf Zeppelin, Germany's first and only aircraft carrier, watching welders work on sections that should have been finished 2 years earlier. The massive vessel, 820 feet of steel, representing the Third Reich's ambitions for naval aviation, sat 85% complete but motionless. 400 miles west, the British Royal Navy operated 6 fleet aircraft carriers. 800 miles south, the Americans were building the Essex-class, ships that would revolutionize naval warfare. And here, in Germany's premier naval facility, a single carrier sat incomplete, its construction halted, its future uncertain, its very existence a monument to strategic confusion. What Ehrlich didn't know as he surveyed the silent deck was that this ship would never launch a single aircraft in combat. The Graf Zeppelin would become the most expensive failure in German naval history, a billion Reichsmark lesson in how industrial incompetence and strategic blindness could transform ambition into embarrassment. Within 5 years, American carriers would be operating by the dozens, launching strikes that would reshape warfare. Within 5 years, Graf Zeppelin would be at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, scuttled by its own navy, having accomplished nothing except proving that Germany fundamentally misunderstood modern naval warfare. The story of Graf Zeppelin begins not with its construction, but with the Kriegsmarine's confusion about what naval power meant in the 20th century. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, had witnessed British carriers in World War I. He understood abstractly that aircraft could extend naval power beyond gun range, but understanding and implementation required more than abstract knowledge. It required industrial capacity, technical expertise, and most critically, a coherent strategy. Germany possessed none of these for carrier operations. In January 1935, Hitler's rearmament program included provisions for 2 aircraft carriers. The Treaty of Versailles restrictions had officially ended, and Germany was free to build whatever navy it chose. The initial specifications called for ships displacing 19,250 tons, carrying 40 aircraft. The design process immediately revealed German naval aviation's fundamental problems. Who would design the aircraft? The Luftwaffe controlled all German aviation, and Hermann Göring had no intention of sharing resources with the Navy. Who would train the pilots? The Kriegsmarine had no carrier aviation expertise, and the Luftwaffe considered naval operations a distraction from continental warfare. Who would develop the doctrine? No German military institution understood carrier operations because Germany had never operated carriers. These questions would haunt Graf Zeppelin from Kiel, laying to scuttling, creating a ship without purpose, aircraft without pilots, and a navy without understanding. On December 28, 1936, at the Deutsche Werke shipyard in Kiel, workers laid the keel for aircraft carrier A, later named Graf Zeppelin after the famous airship Pioneer. The christening ceremony on December 8, 1938, was attended by Hitler himself. The Führer watched as the Countess von Zeppelin, daughter of the airship inventor, smashed a bottle of champagne against the bow of the 23,200-ton hull. The ceremony was magnificent, the photography spectacular, the propaganda value immense. The strategic thinking was absent. By 1938, Graf Zeppelin's specifications had evolved into something more ambitious and more problematic. Displacement increased to 33,550 tons, fully loaded. Length reached 820 feet, with a beam of 103 feet. The flight deck measured 787 feet by 118 feet. Armor included a 2.4-inch belt and 1.6-inch deck protection. Armament consisted of 16 5.9-inch guns in twin turrets, 12 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 22 37mm and 28 20mm cannons. Speed was projected at 33.8 knots from 200,000 shaft horsepower. Aircraft capacity would be 42 planes total. These specifications revealed Germany's fundamental confusion about carrier design. No other nation armed carriers with 16 heavy guns in 8 twin turrets. Carriers were meant to launch aircraft, not fight surface engagements. The heavy gun armament consumed space, weight, and resources that could have improved aviation facilities. But German designers, lacking carrier experience, treated Graf Zeppelin like a hybrid battleship carrier, a confused compromise that satisfied neither role effectively. The aircraft problem proved even more intractable. In 1938, the Luftwaffe agreed to provide naval variants of existing aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf-109T would serve as the carrier fighter, modified with folding wings, arrestor hooks, and reinforced landing gear. The Junkers Ju-87C would function as the dive bomber, similarly modified for carrier operations. Initial plans called for 12 Bf-109Ts and 30 Ju-87Cs. These modifications sounded simple, but proved catastrophically complex. The Bf-109's narrow landing gear, already problematic on land, became dangerous on a pitching carrier deck. The wing folding mechanism added weight and complexity while providing minimal benefit. The arrestor hook system required complete redesign of the rear fuselage. The Ju-87C modifications were equally problematic, adding weight that degraded already mediocre performance. By 1939, prototype testing revealed what British and American naval aviators had learned through decades of experience. Carrier aircraft required specific designs, not modifications of land planes. They needed stronger landing gear, better low-speed handling, improved visibility for deck landings, and robust construction for the violent stresses of carrier operations. Germany was learning these lessons from scratch, while its enemies operated proven systems refined over 20 years. The pilot training problem was worse. In 1938, the Luftwaffe established Trägergruppe 186, Carrier Group 186, to provide pilots for Graf Zeppelin. Approximately 40 pilots began training on converted airfields with simulated carrier decks. They practiced short takeoffs and arrested landings using primitive equipment, but they never practiced actual carrier landings because Germany had no carrier. They trained on stationary decks while American pilots practiced on moving flight decks in open ocean. They simulated operations that their American counterparts performed routinely. September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. Graf Zeppelin sat 85% complete in Kiel, lacking engines, electronics, and most importantly, purpose. Admiral Raeder faced an immediate crisis. Should he complete the carrier for a naval war that was already underway, or divert resources to U-boats and surface raiders that could immediately threaten British commerce? The decision to halt Graf Zeppelin's construction in April 1940 revealed strategic priorities. Germany would fight a commerce war with submarines, not a fleet engagement with carriers. This decision was tactically sound, but strategically revealing. Germany had spent enormous resources building a ship it now realized it didn't need and couldn't effectively use. The comparison with Allied carrier development during this same period exposes the gulf between German confusion and Allied competence. In 1936, when Graf Zeppelin's keel was laid, the United States Navy operated 3 fleet carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, and Ranger. The British Royal Navy operated 6 fleet carriers, including Ark Royal, the most advanced carrier in the world. Both nations possessed 2 decades of carrier operational experience. Both had developed aircraft specifically for carrier operations. Both had trained thousands of pilots in carrier procedures. Both understood carrier doctrine, having practiced it in annual fleet exercises. When Graf Zeppelin's construction halted in April 1940, the contrast had widened dramatically. The United States was building the Essex class, a design that would dominate the Pacific War. These carriers displaced 27,100 tons, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, and incorporated every lesson learned from 20 years of carrier operations. They featured deck-edge elevators that didn't interrupt flight operations, sophisticated damage control systems, and anti-aircraft armament designed specifically for carrier defense. Most importantly, they were designed by engineers who understood carrier operations intimately. The British, despite economic constraints, operated 7 fleet carriers by 1940 and were building more. These ships and their aircraft had already proven their worth. In November 1940, British carriers would demonstrate carrier aviation's potential by attacking the Italian fleet at Taranto, sinking 3 battleships with torpedo bombers launched from HMS Illustrious. This single raid, costing 2 aircraft, accomplished what months of surface warfare couldn't achieve, validating carrier aviation as a decisive weapon. Germany observed these developments with growing alarm, but no comprehension. The Taranto raid should have been a revelation that carriers were the future of naval warfare. Instead, German naval leadership concluded that Taranto proved the vulnerability of surface fleets to air attack, a lesson that confirmed their bias towards submarines, rather than suggesting they should accelerate Graf Zeppelin's completion. In June 1942, with the Eastern Front consuming all available resources, Gross Admiral Raeder proposed resuming Graf Zeppelin's construction. The strategic situation had changed. Germany faced a prolonged war requiring every possible weapon. The carrier sat in Kiel 85% complete, representing 1 billion Reichsmarks of investment that produced 0 capability. Completing it seemed logical. Hitler approved the resumption in May 1942, authorizing completion with updated anti-aircraft armament and modified aircraft complement. Work recommenced with enthusiasm but immediate problems. The original aircraft designs were obsolete. The Bf-109T had been surpassed by improved variants. The Ju-87C was a death trap in 1942's air combat environment. New aircraft were needed, specifically designed for carrier operations, incorporating 4 years of combat lessons. The Luftwaffe had no interest in providing them. Goering considered carrier aviation a distraction and refused to allocate resources. The Me-155, a proposed carrier fighter derived from the Bf-109, existed only on paper. The Ju-87E, an improved carrier dive bomber, remained a concept. Without aircraft, completing Graf Zeppelin was pointless. The pilot problem had grown worse. Trägergruppe 186 had disbanded when construction halted in 1940. The trained pilots had transferred to other units, many dying in combat over Britain, Russia, or the Mediterranean. Starting pilot training from scratch in 1942 required resources the Luftwaffe wouldn't provide. Germany was training barely enough pilots to replace combat losses. Training specialist carrier pilots for a ship that might never be operational was impossible. But the most intractable problem was strategic. What would Graf Zeppelin do? In the Atlantic, British anti-submarine forces were already too strong for a carrier to operate safely without powerful surface escorts Germany didn't possess. In the Baltic, there were no targets worthy of a fleet carrier. In the Arctic, Graf Zeppelin would face British carriers with 2 decades more operational experience. Every scenario analysis concluded the same. Graf Zeppelin would be more valuable as raw materials than as an operational warship. The contrast with American carrier operations in 1942 demonstrated Germany's complete failure to understand naval aviation. On June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway, American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, fundamentally shifting Pacific War momentum. This battle, fought entirely by aircraft with surface ships never sighting each other, proved that carriers had replaced battleships as naval warfare's decisive weapon. American carriers launched aircraft that sank enemy carriers 200 miles away, a capability that revolutionized naval operations. The American success at Midway rested on foundations Germany never built. The United States Navy had trained carrier pilots since 1922, accumulating 20 years of operational experience. American naval aviators understood carrier operations instinctively, having practiced them thousands of times. American carriers operated as task forces with integrated anti-aircraft defense, combat air patrols, and coordinated strike packages. American aircraft, the SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber and TBD Devastator Torpedo Bomber, despite their limitations, were designed specifically for carrier operations. Most critically, American naval doctrine understood carriers not as support weapons, but as the primary striking force. Germany in 1942 possessed none of these capabilities. Graf Zeppelin, even if completed, would be a single ship without support infrastructure, without trained pilots, without suitable aircraft, without doctrine, and without strategic purpose. It would be an expensive target, not a weapon. In January 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz replaced Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz was a submarine officer who considered surface ships resource sinks. He evaluated Graf Zeppelin with brutal pragmatism and reached an inescapable conclusion. The carrier would never be operationally effective, and continuing construction wasted resources desperately needed elsewhere. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler, enraged by German surface ships' failure at the Battle of the Barents Sea, ordered all major warship construction halted. Graf Zeppelin's construction stopped permanently. The ship sat at Gotenhafen, modern Gdynia, Poland, 95% complete, fitted with engines that would never run at sea, guns that would never fire in combat, and a flight deck that would never launch aircraft. The final act of Graf Zeppelin's meaningless existence came in April 1945 as Soviet forces advanced toward Gotenhafen. Rather than let the carrier fall into Soviet hands, German forces scuttled it on April 25, 1945, in shallow water. The Soviets raised the ship in March 1946, towed it to Leningrad for examination, then used it as a target ship. In August 1947, the Soviet Navy sank Graf Zeppelin with bombs, torpedoes, and gunfire in weapons tests, finally destroying what Germany's strategic confusion had created. The financial cost of Graf Zeppelin staggers. Construction consumed approximately 1 billion Reichsmarks in the 1930s currency, equivalent to roughly $4 billion today. This expenditure produced zero operational capability, zero combat missions, zero aircraft launched, and zero strategic value. For comparison, 1 billion Reichsmarks could have built approximately 40 U-boats, which despite their ultimate failure, at least threatened Allied commerce. It could have built 3,000 Bf-109 fighters, which would have significantly strengthened homeland defense. It could have built 1,000 Panzer IV tanks, desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Instead, it built a ship that never fought, proving that Germany fundamentally misunderstood naval warfare in the industrial age. The contrast with American carrier production demonstrates not just quantitative superiority, but qualitative understanding. While Germany struggled to complete one carrier over 9 years, America built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers in 4 years. While Germany couldn't decide what aircraft to operate from its carrier, America produced specialized carrier aircraft by the thousands. While German naval aviation remained a concept, American carrier aviation became a war-winning capability. The Essex-class carriers, contemporary with Graf Zeppelin's final construction period, embodied everything Germany failed to achieve. They displaced 27,100 tons standard, carried 90 to 100 aircraft, achieved 33 knot speed, and incorporated sophisticated damage control systems. But their real superiority lay in operational effectiveness. Essex-class carriers could launch and recover aircraft in conditions that would ground Graf Zeppelin. They could operate continuously for months. They could conduct night operations, anti-submarine warfare, close air support, and fleet defense simultaneously. Most importantly, they were part of an integrated system including trained pilots, specialized aircraft, established doctrine, and supporting infrastructure. American carrier operations in 1944 demonstrated industrial warfare at its apex. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, sometimes operated 15 fleet carriers simultaneously, launching strikes of 500 aircraft that devastated Japanese positions across hundreds of miles. These operations required not just ships, but logistics, training, doctrine, and industrial support that Germany never conceived. A single American carrier task group operated more aircraft than the entire Luftwaffe could concentrate in many theaters. The pilot training differential was equally stark. By 1944, American naval aviators received approximately 600 hours of flight training before entering combat, including extensive carrier qualification. They practiced on actual carriers, learning deck operations through repeated experience. German naval aviation in 1944 was theoretical, with no pilots qualified for carrier operations and no infrastructure to train them. The doctrine gap was widest. American carrier doctrine, refined through 20 years of fleet exercises and 3 years of combat, understood carriers as offensive weapons that projected power hundreds of miles from the fleet. Carriers operated in task groups with integrated defense, coordinated strikes, and continuous air patrols. The concept of the carrier task force, with multiple carriers operating together, multiplied effectiveness exponentially. Germany never developed comparable doctrine because it never operated carriers, creating a vicious cycle where lack of experience prevented development of capability. Graf Zeppelin's sister ship, aircraft carrier B, never received even a name. Laid down in 1938, construction halted at 15% completion in 1940. Workers scrapped it for raw materials in 1943. This unnamed ship represented Germany's carrier ambitions more accurately than Graf Zeppelin, abandoned before becoming real, consumed for parts, forgotten by history. The human stories surrounding Graf Zeppelin reveal institutional dysfunction beyond technical problems. Kapitan Hermann Ehrlich, assigned as prospective commander in 1942, spent months studying carrier operations through translated foreign manuals because Germany had no domestic expertise. He visited the incomplete ship regularly, visualizing operations he knew would never occur, commanding a vessel that would never sail to combat. The Trägergruppe, 186 pilots, trained for carrier operations in 1938 and 1939, were gradually absorbed into regular Luftwaffe units. Most died in combat over Russia or Britain, their specialized training wasted. Lieutenant Hans Weber, one of the few survivors, recalled in a 1968 interview that they practiced carrier landings on a painted deck at Kiel-Holtenau airfield using primitive arrestor gear, imagining they were landing on a moving flight deck at sea. "We knew it was theater," he said, "but we practiced as if it were real because we wanted to believe Germany could build a carrier navy like America or Britain." The shipyard workers at Kiel and later Gotenhafen continued work during periods of resumed construction with dedication, despite knowing the ship would likely never be finished. They took pride in their craftsmanship, even as strategic reality made their work meaningless. When Graf Zeppelin was finally scuttled in 1945, these workers witnessed the destruction of years of effort, billions of Reichsmarks, and Germany's naval aviation ambitions. The Luftwaffe engineers tasked with developing carrier aircraft faced impossible demands. They were ordered to modify land-based fighters and dive bombers for carrier operations without understanding carrier operations themselves. They designed arrestor hooks based on foreign photographs, created folding wing mechanisms without experience, and reinforced landing gear without comprehending the stresses of carrier landings. Their work was technically sophisticated, but strategically irrelevant because it addressed the wrong problems. German naval observers who witnessed British and American carrier operations reported back with detailed analyses that were largely ignored. After observing Royal Navy carriers in the Mediterranean through intelligence reports, one analyst wrote in 1941 that British carrier doctrine emphasized flexibility, continuous operations, and integration with surface forces. His report concluded that Germany would need at least 5 years of peacetime experimentation to develop comparable capability. This conclusion, entirely accurate, was politically unacceptable and strategically impossible. The strategic blindness surrounding Graf Zeppelin reflected broader German failures in understanding industrial warfare. Germany's military leadership, trained in continental warfare, thought in terms of decisive battles and operational art. They understood tanks, artillery, and infantry coordination. They never grasped that naval warfare in the industrial age was about logistics, sustained operations, and power projection. Carriers were not simply ships with aircraft, but floating air bases requiring massive support infrastructure. Admiral Raeder's decision to build carriers in 1935 reflected status competition rather than strategic thinking. Britain and America had carriers, therefore Germany needed carriers. This reasoning ignored that Britain and America had developed carriers over decades, learning through experimentation, failure, and refinement. Germany expected to duplicate 20 years of development in 5 years, a fantasy that reality demolished. The technical challenges alone should have given German planners pause. Carrier operations require aircraft elevators that move planes between hangar and flight deck in minutes. Graf Zeppelin's elevators, designed without operational experience, were slower and less reliable than contemporary British and American systems. The arresting gear, crucial for safe landings, was based on incomplete understanding of the forces involved. The catapults, necessary for launching heavily loaded aircraft, were adapted from coastal defense catapults without proper testing. Every system revealed the difference between theoretical design and operational requirement. The fire control problem demonstrated Germany's confusion about carrier purpose. Graf Zeppelin's 16 5.9-inch guns required sophisticated fire control systems for surface engagement. These systems consumed weight, volume, and electrical power that could have improved aviation facilities. But German designers, viewing carriers as auxiliary warships rather than aviation platforms, prioritized surface combat capability. This decision reflected strategic confusion about what carriers were meant to do. The comparison with Japanese carrier development provides an instructive parallel. Japan, like Germany, came late to carrier aviation, commissioning its first carrier, Hosho, in 1922. But Japan recognized its deficit and invested heavily in catching up, sending officers to observe British and American operations, experimenting aggressively and learning from mistakes. By 1941, Japanese carrier aviation was qualitatively equal to American, with superbly trained pilots, excellent aircraft, and sophisticated doctrine. This parity didn't last because Japan couldn't sustain losses, but it demonstrated that late-starting nations could achieve carrier competence through commitment and learning. Germany never made that commitment. Graf Zeppelin remained a prestige project rather than a serious military program. When strategic reality forced choices between carriers and U-boats, between naval aviation and homeland defense, carriers lost because they were never truly integrated into German military thinking. The destruction of Graf Zeppelin in 1947 by Soviet weapons tests revealed one final irony. The ship that Germany couldn't complete or operate absorbed significant punishment before sinking. Soviet reports indicate it took multiple bomb hits, several torpedo strikes, and gunfire from destroyers before finally going down. The physical ship was sound. The strategic thinking behind it was bankrupt. In archives across Germany, documentation of Graf Zeppelin tells a story not of technical incompetence, but strategic confusion. The engineering was generally competent. the construction quality acceptable, the design theoretically sound. The failure was conceptual. Germany built a weapon without understanding what it was for, how to use it, or why it mattered. American and British naval analysts studied Graf Zeppelin after the war, examining plans, specifications, and the raised hull. Their reports reached unanimous conclusions. The ship could have been made operational with sufficient effort, but would have been ineffective in combat due to inexperienced crews, inadequate aircraft, and absence of doctrine. One British report concluded that Graf Zeppelin, operational in 1942, would have survived approximately 2 weeks against Royal Navy carriers before being sunk or forced into port permanently. The true cost of Graf Zeppelin extended beyond the billion Reichsmarks directly spent. The project consumed engineering talent, industrial capacity, and strategic attention that could have been applied to weapons Germany understood. The missed opportunity cost of Graf Zeppelin might exceed its direct cost. Those resources applied to U-boat production could have built 40 additional submarines. Applied to armor production could have equipped several panzer divisions. Applied to fighter production could have delayed Allied bomber offensive by months. Modern historians recognize Graf Zeppelin as a case study in strategic failure. Dr. Erich Groner, the authoritative German naval historian, concluded that Graf Zeppelin represented the Kriegsmarine's lack of clear strategic vision. The ship was built because carriers seemed important, not because Germany had a plan to use them effectively. Professor Norman Friedman, American naval analyst, called Graf Zeppelin the most expensive failed weapons program of World War II relative to its producing nation's economy, consuming resources Germany desperately needed while providing zero capability. The lessons of Graf Zeppelin extend beyond World War II. Military organizations still struggle with the temptation to acquire prestigious weapons without understanding how to employ them. The carrier appeared modern and powerful, so Germany wanted one, but desire doesn't create capability. Effective military power requires not just weapons, but training, doctrine, experience, and integration into strategic thinking. Graf Zeppelin failed not because German engineers couldn't build carriers, but because German military culture didn't understand them. In the hierarchy of German World War II failures, Graf Zeppelin occupies a unique position. Unlike strategic disasters like Stalingrad or Kursk, it harmed Germany through waste rather than loss. Unlike the V-2 rocket program, which was strategically worthless but technically advanced, Graf Zeppelin was neither innovative nor useful. It was simply a billion Reichsmark mistake that proved Germany fundamentally misunderstood naval warfare in the industrial age. Today, the wreck of Graf Zeppelin lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, north of Gdansk, Poland, at approximately 80 meters depth. Polish and German divers occasionally explore the wreck, finding a surprisingly intact structure given its violent end. The flight deck, which never launched an aircraft, lies covered in marine growth. The catapults, which never launched a plane, are rusted solid. The aircraft elevators, which never raised a fighter to the deck, are frozen in place. The entire ship is a museum of failure, a billion Reichsmark monument to strategic confusion. The final irony of Graf Zeppelin is that Germany's only aircraft carrier achieved its greatest moment of historical significance through failure. It demonstrated conclusively that industrial warfare required more than engineering capability. It proved that prestige projects without strategic purpose waste resources. It showed that imitating others' weapons without understanding their employment leads to expensive incompetence. These lessons, written in rust and steel at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, remain relevant today. Graf Zeppelin never left port for combat operations, never launched an aircraft in anger, never fulfilled its purpose. But in failing completely, it succeeded in teaching a brutal lesson. Strategic confusion is more expensive than enemy action, and building weapons you don't understand how to use is the most efficient way to lose a war. Germany learned this lesson too late at a cost of 1 billion Reichsmarks. uncounted hours of skilled labor, and the permanent embarrassment of knowing that its only aircraft carrier's greatest accomplishment was demonstrating what happens when ambition exceeds understanding. The hull lies quietly now, home to Baltic fish, visited by curious divers, forgotten by most except military historians and naval enthusiasts. But Graf Zeppelin's story remains powerfully relevant. A cautionary tale about the dangers of building weapons without strategy, of pursuing prestige over capability, and of fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of modern warfare. While American carriers ruled the Pacific and British carriers controlled the Mediterranean, Germany's carrier sat incomplete, unused, and ultimately worthless, the most expensive nothing ever built by the Third Reich.